Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life. This week, we had Shabina Begum on the show, and we had an insightful conversation about international child abduction and the steps to get your child back. I hope this episode is valuable to anyone who might be listening. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Shabina Begum is joining us. Shabina is a partner in the International Child Care Department at Goodman Ray Solicitors in London, England. She specializes in international child abduction, forced marriage, and so much more. Today, Shabina and I will be discussing international time sharing or custody, what happens if your child is taken to another country in the middle of a divorce, and how to avoid any potentially sticky international custody situations. Welcome to the show, Shabina.
Thank you very much for the welcome and that wonderful introduction. It's lovely to see you on screen, Heather.
Oh, it is so lovely to see you. And for our listeners, when I was in London at the beginning of the summer, Shabina and I got to meet in person, and it was just, we could have talked forever. I was so fascinated by her practice, the differences, and I'm very excited and so honored that you would give us your time today for our podcast.
No, thank you. Thank you. I know you stand strong so much for what all of women stand for. So it's an absolute honor to be here, honestly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, Shabina, for our listeners, please share a little bit about how you got to where you are professionally, because I am, of course, fascinated by the entire legal process in the UK.
Sure. So I won't go all the way to when I was 13. I wanted to become a lawyer. Which is a fun fact. I think most lawyers say that. But essentially, the way our training works, you'll have to forgive me as well. I do have a bit of a cough situation, so I don't ordinarily have a husky voice, and nor is that a requirement to become a lawyer in the UK. So essentially, what I decided to do, because I knew I took to some extent a conventional law route in the UK as it was then, but it's changed so much now. So I did a law degree. I did a 3-year law degree, what we have as called the undergraduate. So you graduate in and with an LLB, and then I proceeded to go on to do what was then the bar vocational course, because I wanted to become a barrister. Of all the other things I was very unsure about in life, I knew as a young woman that in order to actually make things right for women and girls, the law was the place. So that was definitely my starting point. And usually what happens is you go on to do 1 year of training in order to qualify as a barrister. Now, what I should throw in is a bit of a caveat, because I know the system in the US and the UK is slightly different, because you can either go on to become a barrister, which if people that have a great imagination, they're usually the people that wear the wigs and then and go to court. And I know in the US you don't have this as a 2-tier system like we do, because you do it all, but essentially that ordinarily used to be the distinction. So you become a barrister, you wear the wig, you go to court, or you become a solicitor, don't wear the wig. I didn't ordinarily used to go to court, so I picked the route with the wig. And so once I'd actually done my bar vocational course, I was called to the bar. I have a glorious photo of myself wearing my hijab as well as the wig. I blame my mother for that, because I was actually exempted on religious grounds, but she told me, you're not a real lawyer unless you wear the wig for the photograph. So I did the thing. And then essentially I went on to then cross-qualify. So I did some additional exams and became a solicitor. And for me, where it all, I'd say, when I look back and think about the inspirational moments in my career, I was that young person who wrote a letter to my hero at the time to say, you know what, I thought I had nothing to lose. I had no other lawyers in my family. Let me give this a go. Let me see if my hero will even acknowledge my letter. And incidentally, she actually interviewed me, and I had the absolute pleasure and honor of working with her for a solid, I think, 8 years, until she passed away during COVID. And she was the absolute queen bee of the law when it came to international family law, forced marriage, all the things that you kindly mentioned in my intro. I learned all from her. So that's been my journey so far. And then I moved to Goodman Ray and became a partner here, which has been another amazing journey in itself. So, and now I sit before you, Heather.
Oh, well, and I am so honored to have you because it's so fascinating. So for our listeners and for me, because I want, if you could clarify, because you do both, the difference between the solicitor and the barrister in your legal system, what that means.
Oh, so I think where it becomes a bit more technically, once you take out the wig situation. So as a family lawyer, family barristers don't wear wigs.
Okay.
And so I think there's less of a distinction now in the solicitor and barrister professions, because I'm aware of lots of solicitors you can apply to do what's called your higher rights. There are additional exams that you do, and you can still go to court. So I think the professions are becoming more and more merged. But essentially the biggest distinction used to be the solicitor. So my day-to-day, and I don't do my own advocacy. So what that means is I will be the person that sees the client. I will sit down with the client. I'll be the person that has that initial consultation with them. I will then set out their case. So I will make that court application. I will then instruct a barrister. So that's when a barrister will come on the scene, and I will say, can you take this application to court? And then sometimes I go to court with the barrister, because obviously I'm the client's point of reference. Sometimes barristers will go by themselves with the client, and another member of my firm will probably go. I usually, because of the kind of cases that I go, I like for my clients to have a point of reference, because going to court is so daunting. And I usually represent a lot of vulnerable women and girls, so I don't want them to do that first part without me, or at least feeling like it's a part of the empowerment process. So I'd say that's the biggest distinction, and that's when barristers will come. They will then stand in front of a judge and represent the case. So that's the main distinction, I would say. I should have also thrown in then, you might ask me this later, so forgive me, but I did actually stop off my career somewhere to go to the US to do an LLM, which was definitely a highlight. And I kind of like casually left that out. So it was incredible being at Cornell and learning so much more about the American legal system, inadvertently, if you like.
Oh, I love that. And well, and of course, our legal system is based on the common law and Queen's law, of course. We've just elaborated, and it's different, obviously now, very much so. So the solicitor is really who initially, as for a title, that's who is initially meeting with clients. I would guess, correct? And then if it needs to be litigated, it goes to the barrister. Now, do you have mediators as well in the UK?
We sure do.
Okay.
So mediators would come in at different points, just like they would in the US. So it may be the court application issuing stage, actually, to see if, usually, for instance, if there's husband, wife, they're going to separate and there are either assets or they have children. So they might want to actually go through a mediator first instead of going to court. Because that then saves, and we always think of the financial cost of going to court, but it also saves them the emotional cost of going to court. And the classic client behavior of, my lawyer will get back to you, but mediation obviously encourages two people to talk more directly with a third person, a professional mediator present. So yes, we also do have mediation, and that's actually quite a compulsory stage proceedings, unless there is domestic abuse, because we recognize that there's a power imbalance when there's domestic abuse involved, and those two people should not be mediating, because they don't have equality of power in the same sense as most couples would.
And now, does family law or matrimonial law, I mean, they're pretty interchangeable here, but would you say that encompasses divorce, custody, child support, and spousal support in the UK, or is it divided differently in any way?
So I feel like this is probably more, so family law as an umbrella would include all of that, as you just mentioned. But at Goodman Ray, we definitely do have slightly smaller divide, if you like. So as you'd read out, I very much specialize in international childcare. So what that includes and encompasses is issues related to children It could niche onto abduction. It could be forced marriage, child marriage, domestic abuse, honor-based abuse. So that's where I sit very comfortably. And then you have matrimonial finances. And as you remember when we met and Trudy was present,
Yes.
so that's Trudy. She's the absolute queen of all things matrimonial finances. And that's where there's spousal maintenance and all talking about assets and matrimonial assets. That's where Trudy will come in. So that's how our team essentially works.
Got it. Which makes sense. And I mean, you do have a big firm, but it's very specialized in that way, is the way at least that sounds to me. Which I think it is on so many levels, because it already started out that way with, solicitor versus barrister. So there is a lot of distinctions and specializations. From my perspective, it seems a little different than the general practice of law throughout the U.S. All right, now I would love to talk about, you've built an impressive career specializing in some really difficult things, but international child abduction, forced marriage, and gender-based violence. I mean, this is heavy stuff that so needs a strong advocate. What inspired you to focus on these areas of the law?
I think that's where my actual journey, my unconventional parts of my journey probably kick in. So essentially, after I'd done my law degree, whilst I knew quite quickly I wanted to do or stand up for rights for women and children, I don't think I stopped to realize what that actually looks like in different communities. Because me being someone of a South Asian Muslim background, very much British, I do believe that different communities experience violence, sometimes abuse slightly differently. And what that means is there's different barriers. The most obvious one that can come to play is linguistic barriers. So I even now represent lots of clients who English isn't their first language. So what does that mean? That's an added layer of vulnerability. So the way I look at it now as an established lawyer was very different to how I looked at it. Obviously, as this young teenage stroke 20-something, where I then did go off and do international research. First stint of international research I did as a Winston Churchill Fellow. And I traveled out to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, I forgot my other country, and India. And essentially, I was then looking at what was a very common feature in a lot of South Asian cases of domestic abuse, which was a threat to attack someone with acid. And so this is me really niching in now, like one of the most initial pieces of research which I did. And what I started to realize is it was such a marker of how women in certain societies and certain communities were viewed as just objects almost. And I think we think about that as a concept now, but to actually see it play out for a man in a situation, and I'm using the male to female scenario just because women and the research which I did focused on that dynamic. And women were the majority victims of acid attacks. And what I started to see, the pattern was a man would threaten to attack a woman with acid if she broke up with him, or if she did something that he didn't like. And I say all this, so this is where, as you asked me what inspired me, I'll always remember going into Cambodia and doing research on a mother and a young child, and having this conversation with this mother who had most of her face disfigured. And she told me that, yes, it was horrifying. And it's the story that stays with you as well as the image, because you start to question, how can anyone actually do this in this civilized society and world that we live in? But it wasn't just the mother, it was the child who also had, like, she was a young girl, had parts of her hair that had gone and parts of her ear that had also burnt off. And I remember interviewing this woman who was gracious enough to speak to me, and all she said to me at the end is, Shabina, I want nothing from you. And as a researcher, you have to dignify your participants, whoever are willing to kind of be a part of your research. And I remember asking her at the end, is there anything I can do to help you further? And she said to me, Shabina, all I ask is that you let the world know that this happened to me and my daughter. And I always held on to that, because if we ever think about actually giving someone a voice, that's the most powerful thing that we can do sometimes when people are silenced. And that for me sums up a lot of the work that I do. So even now, when I think about the work of child marriage, it's advocating for usually a child who they themselves don't know what their needs are. And they're very impressionable, and they're probably going to give into their parents saying, but this is good for you, or we need you to do this for us. But they're a child. And actually their needs are to be educated, their needs are to be of good health. And we know that. We all know that in terms of, you know, in civil society, in terms of when we think of human rights, but not a young child is not going to be able to articulate that. So just in that same way, when we think about child abduction, every child has rights to get to know both parents. So no child should be just taken from one jurisdiction to another without both of their parents having some kind of say. And for me, it's that in every case that I do, I think about, okay, what's the voice here that's missing? And usually in a lot of those cases, I represent mums who may have either had their child taken away from them, or in some cases, the mother themselves is stranded in another jurisdiction after being married to a British citizen. So how do I then reconcile or repatriate that mother with their British child? And these are the things that I look out for. So that was the starting point, but that's definitely what still inspires me now in a lot of the work that I do.
Now, when do you, like, at what point do you get involved in these cases that, well, I guess, you know, a child abduction, you know, out of the jurisdiction, that's probably as soon as that happens. Is that how that works?
Well, in an ideal world, yes, you'd hope that we'd be able to, exactly, but you'd be surprised. So and I love that that's your like starting premise. Like, when do we get involved? At different points. So sometimes I can have clients that will come to me 5-6 years down the line, okay, saying, yes, this is what happened X years ago. And you kind of sit there and you just think, actually, and it's not a judgmental way. As a lawyer, we're always hoping that they would have come quicker. But then you start to wonder, what happened in your relationship to stop you from seeking legal advice? And this is almost one of those areas where you see that disconnect between the law and families, because families don't actually want to go to lawyers. They could have spent 5 years, two parents arguing over this, or trying to almost, and I have this sometimes with lots of fathers who are like, but I didn't want the relationship to end. And I knew once I'd go to lawyers, that would be the end of it. And that's what happened. So to answer when we come in at various points, usually the 5-year mark is probably a little too late, but we can usually investigate, unless there are exceptional circumstances. So I'm not going to, you know, basically paint all pictures with the same brush, but all cases with the same brush. But sometimes you do have cases where, as soon as they've been taken to another jurisdiction, someone will get in touch. So one of the parents might get in touch with us, or may have contacted the police. And then the police have said to them, well, go to a family lawyer, because it is a crime. Abduction is a crime in the UK. I believe it's a crime in the US as well. But you can correct me if I'm wrong. But it's just one of those areas where people don't realize that they need to go to lawyers. And that's why they don't act or react as fast as they could. And there have, however, been some cases where we've got in there quite quickly, and then we can go and get the injunction. So when the initial threats are made, we can go in and prevent a child from being abducted or removed from this jurisdiction by getting an injunction. So that has happened as well. So what I'm trying to say is I can come in at any point of the process. It's not as seamless as we'd like for it to be, unfortunately.
Yeah. So really what would happen in the US, like, and this is, it would not be criminal if it is both parents, and even if, say, they're divorced, right? So you can have, they're still married, maybe in the middle of a divorce or thinking about it. And I think the most, you know, the best example for like listeners is, you know, dual citizen. Of course, there's so many people who do have that. And let's just say the mother or father leaves the US with the children to their country of origin. there's nothing in the criminal law or the government that they're going to really do to help that other parent. You will have to go and file in family law. And whether it's a post-divorce and maybe they're, not abiding by the court order, but you would have to get, and we'll talk certainly more in depth, like, okay, what happens? You get an order in the US. Now what do you do? But yeah, that's generally how that would work here. Even if it's just, different states in the US that every one of our states has, different particular laws, but it would still be in civil court, with the, with the families and the children. Now, you've represented clients from diverse regions, including North America, greater Gulf countries, and Asia Pacific. How do you navigate the cultural and legal complexities in those types of cases?
So it's obviously, as you've said, just as the regions vary, the approach also varies. So as you'll be aware, because the US and the UK, we're signed to the Hague Convention. So when it comes to abduction, it will usually be within the umbrella of a Hague proceedings. But if it's not a country that signed up to the Hague Convention, then we enter what's called wardship territory in the UK. So if it is usually the Gulf region, for instance, we'd have to go to the High Court and say that this child has been abducted. For instance, if they've been taken out of the UK and they need to be brought back to the UK. And wardship it's a High Court jurisdiction. So those proceedings have to start at the High Court. And a High Court judge will usually usually if it's a British child or if it's a child who is habitually resident here. And what that means is that if the parents agreed to live here, or if they lived here long enough that this is their main country of residence, then usually a British judge will intervene. I'm sorry, that might be me. British judge will intervene and say that that child should return to this jurisdiction. That can be the starting point because usually there's two sides to a story. So that's usually when it comes to abduction, it's usually that. So it's either an action under the Hague Convention or wardship proceedings. Where it gets really complicated is obviously when there are additional issues. For instance, if there's a lot of the cases that I do, there might be an element of forced marriage or child marriage if it's a young child and it's an abduction, or there might also be the ancillary issue of a possible female genital mutilation that's about to happen in another country. So when you're talking about cultural nuances, those are the things that I have to really look out for and fish out. When I've got a child that's been removed from the jurisdiction, I have to think about, okay, what's the purpose? Is it a country where there's a higher prevalence of FGM, which is female genital mutilation? Is it a country where there's a possibility that then they're going to be subjected to a forced or child marriage? So it's that. So when I'm speaking to a client, I'm also very mindful of, okay, what else is going on here? So when you speak to a client, it's about finding out, as you've mentioned, dual nationality. Do they have another passport? Do they have some kind of ID card that could make them even more vulnerable for onward movement to a third jurisdiction? And so these are the issues that I have to really kind of look out for when I'm having those conversations. Or for instance, one of the classic kind of scenarios where I've had lots of young girls who are taken out of the country just before they turn 18, because the parents have found out that they have a boyfriend here. And it might be, for instance, if we use the Gulf region, because we've mentioned it before, a young girl from somewhere in the Gulf region, so just say Dubai for the sake of argument, and she's found to have a young friend or male friend, or sometimes with young couples who don't openly come out as being homosexual, but the parents suspect that they might be. So that could be another reason why they're taken out of the jurisdiction. So these are all of the issues that we do have to spot. And I'll always ask the question, because as a lawyer, I genuinely believe we're better off being cautious and being, I don't care if I'm culturally inappropriate, I will do it if it means that I can better protect one of my clients. So that's the quagmire that I have to navigate, if you like.
Absolutely. And so, who comes to you though? Because, right, if the parents, it's obviously the parents maybe don't agree, right? Yeah. And maybe I'll just say for an example, the father takes the daughter out of the country and the mother is concerned that maybe he's going to marry her, have her married or whatever. Is that how that works as far as who contacts you? Because I imagine obviously the child is gone, the young woman who may be married off or whatever, and obviously someone is reached out to you on her behalf.
Yeah, so it can be a raft of people when it comes to, if you like, the forced marriage or the FGM setup. So it can be the parents. In FGM cases, I'd say I've represented a majority of fathers because what's quite unique, if you like, about, and I'm not saying men don't facilitate it, they do. But what's quite unique about FGM is it's such a female perpetrator-led kind of abuse. And what I mean by that is to quote, I think it was Mona El-Tahawy, a famous author who speaks about this in her book. I think it's called Hymen and Hijab. And she talks about it's a great, well, I enjoyed it, so I do recommend it. But I always quote her and I credit the book because she speaks about the concept of the foot soldiers of patriarchy. Now, if we think of FGM as that kind of abuse which has been handed down, because it only happens to women. I know male circumcision happens, and with male circumcision, the argument is there's some medical benefit, and sometimes you have to do the procedure for men. I don't understand it. I'm not going to go into the medical ins and outs, but with female FGM, essentially, because it's genital mutilation, there is no benefit. There are just no benefits to it. And so that's why when you think about that, okay, what does it mean to be a foot soldier of patriarchy? So these women have upheld this standard to say, okay, women, I was cut, my grandmother was cut, so therefore, the women that come afterwards, so we must continue this.
Okay.
Yes, to make sure that, every woman of our family, the next generation, continue to feel part of this community, continue to feel part of this cultural tradition. And I think that's so important to remember, because some of the risk assessments that I've done, I've had to ask to be done in some of my cases, you do have to look at, okay, what's the propensity? Was mum cut? Does she have any sisters? Like, how prevalent is it in this family? Now, I kind of come to all of this to say that that's why I've had more fathers, in my opinion, come forward. That because a lot of them actually are not involved with the procedure, because once they are then taken, the young girls or girl is taken out of the jurisdiction, they're then handed over to usually a female cutter in another jurisdiction, or a female cutter in this jurisdiction. So essentially, father has no real physical involvement, except for where I have represented mothers, when father has actually facilitated the travel. So the travel to the jurisdiction for the FGM. So to answer your question in terms of who comes forward, so in FGM cases, I've represented both mother, father, but then I've also represented the young people as well. So sometimes it might be the school that has come forward to us. So whilst we have social services that will take that responsibility, or what we refer to as local authority during proceedings, if they don't act fast enough, sometimes I have had to go in and say, look, to a High Court judge, there's this young person, there's a risk that they're going to travel, there's an FGM risk, they have come to me, the local authority are not responding, please help. So sometimes actually I've had friends, had boyfriends come forward in forced marriage cases as well. And the risk there is, and you have to be very careful with this, is once you declare any kind of involvement of the boyfriend during proceedings, that's putting your client at extra risk. So that's why those cases have to be crafted in a very skillful manner. So whenever I have someone come forward, I kind of assess the situation in front of me. But they come, once again, just like the stage of litigation, the raft of applicants or clients can sometimes vary depending on how they've got that information for help. So for instance, if it's the forced marriage unit that's given information out about forced marriage, sometimes someone will read that information go to the forced marriage union and suddenly realize, oh, I can actually get a lawyer for this, and then they'll come to my door.
Okay,
So
understand.
different
Right.
vital points once again.
It's fascinating. There's so much to talk about, but I do want to bring it back a little bit to the US and the UK. Let's say that you're dual citizens, you know, you don't know where to file for divorce. How would you advise a client to decide that? You know, and obviously children are involved, and you know, how I would imagine that would be something that maybe you would help them with, is, you know, trying to figure out where do they file, how do maybe they keep their children in the UK and their spouses in the US.
Yes. So that, my cop-out answer to that is that's definitely more of a question for Trudy.
Okay.
But when it comes to divorce, the other thing I know a lot of people do have to think about, in addition to the children, is actually where are the assets? You know, for people, and this is definitely I think that I should probably just leave it at that. Definitely go to a specialist divorce lawyer, and we do international divorce. But that's definitely the other key thing at play. Think about where majority of the assets are, and then speak to a lawyer about exactly where you want to get, you know, the maximum kind of settlement depending on the length of the marriage. So yes, so I would say come to us, and I will hand this over to Trudy.
Got it. Okay, well, that's good to know, because there are, and I think that's important for our listeners. There's more than just one thing to think about.
Oh yeah.
Which is why you have to speak with a lawyer. And oftentimes, when in the US and the UK, to understand what would the different scenarios, and if even it's something you can do or move forward within the UK. Now, within, you know, England, obviously, it's a large country. I would imagine, and that's why I wanted to ask, you know, because here in the US, we have different states, and there are different laws within, you know, by state, and obviously different, you know, say, I don't know if it's customs, like within the law, within even Florida, though, you're going to have different types of interpretations of the law in the northern part of Florida versus the southern part of Florida. How does it work in the UK? Is it a similar based on maybe the counties or the boroughs? How does that work?
So in the UK, if we break that down, so England and Wales, we're regulated by the same laws. And then Scotland have slightly different laws to us. And it's similar to Ireland. So that's why you wouldn't get someone who practices in England and Wales practicing in Scotland, for instance, without qualifying there as well. But then when you speak about on the county level, I think that's where, and I think for me, what blew my mind when I was learning the basic American legal system, which you have to do in order to do the LLM, it's the distinction between the federal and then the state to state. And I went in naive, because initially when I went to do research in the US, I did think I could do research on, oh, I'm so sorry, I've got construction in the background. I hope you can't hear it.
We cannot.
Good. But I really thought I could do a UK-US comparison, only to learn the better comparison would probably be US to when we used to be a part of Europe, because then we do have like a central European Human Rights Court, which it's a bit ropey now as a comparison, but when I did my LLM, it was a bit more relevant. So that's what I would say. I'd say the US is just so much more vast, and your laws and the way you like state to state is regulated is just so different to the UK. But certainly once you're in England and Wales, the way the laws would work on a county level, you know, you're still regulated by the laws of England and Wales. So we'd have essentially you'd have county courts. So this is the family law system. So either what are called county courts or family law courts now. And then if you wanted to appeal, you'd go to the High Court. And that's true of England and Wales. And then if you wanted to appeal from the High Court, you go to the Court of Appeal, and then you go to the Supreme Court. So that's how our law is structured now, essentially.
Got it. Now, would you be the one involved to say if, someone from another country, their spouse, may, or I don't know if it matters if they, are a citizen of the UK, but, a parent has the child in the UK, and then say another individual is like, but we want to get them back, right? Like, or they're not returning them. I would probably advise, well, obviously I would call you first, but I would advise that individual, they're going to need a lawyer.
Yes.
In England to help them maneuver, because that's where the child physically is.
That's it.
And
so that's
would you help them with something like that?
Yes, absolutely. So that's one of the ways where a UK court, or an English court, can have jurisdiction as physical presence. But then the other factors would be, okay, so how long has the child been here? How integrated is the child in England, Wales? For instance, if they've been going to school for over a year, and the year is kind of sometimes used as like a barometer of integration. So how are they integrated here? How old are they? How much do they understand of what's happened in the UK? Say they're with their mother. Why did it take the father so long to issue proceedings? Was there some kind of agreement? Did it start off as a 6-month holiday and then mum just overstayed? Which is probably a very common scenario that you also come across as well. So there's various factors we definitely have to think about, but absolutely. For instance, if it was the other way around and they were in the US, I would definitely say to them, please go and get some advice from Heather. And likewise here, because you just need to know what has happened in that time that they've been in England. Are we talking about, okay, this child is integrated enough for them to remain here, or are we talking summary return territory, which is actually, if the father did issue proceedings here, this child would have to be summarily returned to the US, for instance. So it could be, it just depends on various factors, but they certainly should come and get some advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's good for our listeners, because our courts and obviously issues with children and being removed from a jurisdiction, without consent, do go higher up on the priority, but it can take some time. And just like you said, it's a 6-month holiday. They extended it, and all of a sudden, if you're not taking action and it's been 9 months, you may have a hard time getting them back. But then they're going to have to probably litigate in England as to how much, custody they will have, I guess, or, will the child go back and forth?
No, that's it. Because that's usually, so I think there'll be 2 tiers of decisions. So for instance, if this child it was an agreed holiday, if we're talking about a similar scenario, and the court does decide that they should go back to the US, then it's a US court that gets to decide when the child returns, how much time each parent gets. But it may be that actually, once they're in court proceedings, the parents decide, well, actually, it makes more sense for this child to be in the UK. But it's better to get that advice to even know which court should make that next step in decision. So actually, should they be agreeing some kind of agreement in advance? Should they not do that? Because that can then also tip the scale as to where the child remains. So you just have to be so cautious in what those steps are, because those 3 months can make a difference, and those conversations usually do make a difference.
Absolutely. Now, okay, so how, I would imagine, let's say they're already divorced, right? A couple, and there's orders on, where they will spend the time. But let's say the father takes the children, and I'll say this because then the wife would come to me, since we represent women, takes the children, he's in England and he's not returning. So obviously she may have a court. I think what I would advise her to, we'd have to get a court order that would order him back. And then I guess she could take that to you, right? And how would England interpret that? Would they abide by something that's another country that says this child has to be returned?
No, of course, if there's a court order already, an American court order saying that this child needs to remain in the US and should be with mum and should be spending this much time with mum and dad, and dad's just brought the child to England. A court here will respect that order, because they'll be able to see that this has already been litigated and that this child should rightfully be in the US. And so this father, what he's done is he's been obstructive and he's brought this child here because he's basically breaching a court order. And we don't reward that kind of behavior. So what the issue then would be really and truly is, okay, is it a question of just going to the High Court and saying, well, look, this child needs to be returned? Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes it's enough to kind of just write the letter to say, look, you need to go back because there's a US court order in place already. Sometimes it might be a bit more, because because sometimes we have this, and I feel like we're having like hypothetical discussions here of, okay, what kind of barriers and obstacles can arise? Sometimes it might be difficult to find the father, in which case, we can still assist. So it's like, okay, so how do you locate someone in the UK? How do you serve him with a court order? In those scenarios, we can still assist. But it would be, mum by then would probably have to issue proceedings here for that child to be summarily returned to the US. Because she's already got a court order from a court saying what the arrangements should be. And then it's a question of, okay, so how do you actually then enforce that? And that's where she'd be at in the US, to say, I want this court order enforced and this child is now in the UK, please help me get my child back. And that's where UK lawyers can assist, or England, an English lawyer can assist, I should say.
Absolutely. Well, and I mean, because we are, such a global world and people travel a lot, and so it's not uncommon. These things happen, and it's hard enough if we know they're in the US somewhere else, but then if they've gone abroad, that just adds a whole nother layer of complexity, I think, and part of what you said, just even finding them, and then at least in the UK, even though sometimes it's difficult to understand, right? Even though it's English, but at least it's both English speaking. And there's not that language barrier that if they took them to another country. Now, I do have a question for you, because, your bio says that you're an expert in transactional abandonment. Could you share for me and our listeners what that is?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I should probably explain. So it's transnational abandonment.
Transnational. I read it wrong.
No, that's what I said. Let me clarify, because I do nothing to do with transaction. Yeah, it's a mouthful though, Heather. So the easiest quote unquote, to explain transnational abandonment. So we had a raft of cases, what lawyers used to refer to as stranded spouses. And what that meant, and that's why as a concept I feel like stranding is slightly easier to explain than transnational abandonment. But the reason the label's flipped is stranding almost suggests an element of blame on the woman, as in she's put herself in a situation where she got stranded. But what that means is, say for instance, there's a British man of Pakistani heritage, so his parents are from Pakistan, very much British, and he decides, or his family decides, that he's going to go to Pakistan and marry an adult, consenting woman in Pakistan, goes over. And what sometimes happens is he will then marry her, bring her over, and apply for her to remain in the UK on a spouse visa. What happens in some of these marriages is, once the woman has had the child, they may fall out, or there's domestic abuse, and what he decides is he's going to further control her and abuse her by returning her to Pakistan. So that's where the stranding happens. And it's a classic scenario in a lot of the cases that I've done, is it will always be a holiday to Pakistan. So it may be that dad, mum, the child all go to Pakistan and they stay there for a couple of weeks. There's either a sister who's getting married, or a grandparent who's about to die, or some kind of
reason to go, right? Some reason to go.
Take them over, yes. And then they'll take them to Pakistan. And usually what will happen in 9 out of 10 cases, father will then not only come back with the child, but then will take away mother's biometric permit. So because she'll still have a Pakistani passport, that's what allows her to re-enter the UK. He will either destroy it or he will bring it back with him, because then she can't now come back to England. She can't enter without that permit. Some fathers will go the extra length and say, I'm such an upstanding citizen, mom has decided to remain in Pakistan forever, here's her biometric card. And so sometimes what will happen is that child, the British child, will come back with the father, and then he abandons mom completely. Or sometimes when he wants to start a new life and take on a new bride and have no trace of that life, he will leave the mother and the child. In those cases, I usually represent the mom. Because transnational abandonment is also a crime in the UK. So what we do is we can then issue, and it's one of those more like niche areas of abduction, if you like, because it almost looks like it could be an immigration issue. It's not. Because the British child is entitled to return to the UK, or this woman is entitled to be reunited with her British child. So we will then go to the High Court and issue wardship proceedings and say that this mother has been transnationally abandoned. And we will try and reunite her with her child, usually in the UK. Or if mom says, well, no, actually, I just want my child to be returned to me in Pakistan, and if they've been living in Pakistan for a slightly lengthier period, the judge might decide, well, actually, no, this child needs to be with mum. So that also has like different scenarios, but usually the abandonment happens once this British man has married the woman, and decided to leave her in another jurisdiction after having a child with her.
Wow. That is obviously common enough for you to become an expert in it. So that is fascinating, but I love this, learning so much. And yeah, I can see how that would be devastating, whether she does want to come back and have her child or just have her child. Either way.
That's it. I mean, to contextualize it a little in terms of like, when I use the Pakistani example, it almost still makes it feel a bit foreign. But if we think about some of the sex tourism that we have, and people go to like Thailand, or usually Thailand, and they get an American man or an Englishman goes over, gets this woman pregnant, and then leaves her and the child. It's the same thing. Because that child is entitled to a British passport. And this is what people don't realize, that this is actually not okay. And there are proceedings that can be brought. I don't, obviously not in the US, but like in the UK, there are laws to actually assist women in that kind of situation.
Wow. Well, that's amazing. I could talk to you for hours and hours, Shabina. This has been amazing. But we are running out of time. But obviously, any international issue with children, at least you're a good place to start, right?
Yes.
With that for our listeners. But before we go, can you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience?
Of course. So I would say actually the biggest lesson that I've learned is when we think about resilience and we think about a lot of the choices that even before we get to womanhood, a lot of the choices that as young women, as children, that girls make, that becomes a part of your journey into adulthood. So when we think about the resilient, strong woman, sometimes we don't stop to think about the choices that she wasn't able to make as a vulnerable young child. And this is, I see it all the time in child marriage cases, in forced marriage cases, these cases where these women are left behind, where I always have to ask, was that first yes into a marriage? Was that first yes to be with that man? Was that your yes? And when that first yes isn't theirs, that their ability to actually make decisions and get through life is somewhat thwarted. And what I tend to find is by the time they've come to me, I am the first person to actually ask them, well, what is it that you want? And when you get by in life, never being asked that question, and suddenly, you've passed most of your life, you start to realize how resilient we are as women, that we don't even stop to think about what we need and want, but we can actually still function in a society to keep building others around us. So that's what I've learned in my career so far.
Wow. Well, that is beautiful and very, very well put. I love it. Now, lastly, Shabina, where can our listeners find more information and resources about you and your practice?
So the best place is definitely, please go on our website. It's literally just Google Goodman Ray Solicitors. You'll find us. I'm also on LinkedIn. So please do find me, Heather. I think I'm connecting to you as well. So I'm the person that's connected to Heather. And I will always put out information and share stuff from my firm in terms of resources. And the other thing I will say to people is, if you've listened to this and you're slightly unsure, but you just want to have a chat, I'm always happy to just have a chat. I would much rather be the person who you ask the question to and then use the resources later than come to me in 5 years' time and I'm asking you, why didn't you actually check? So this is your PSA. If you haven't asked the question, please come forward and ask now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we will, of course, have all of Shabina's information in our show notes. And we've reached the end of our show today. Thank you so much, Shabina, for joining us to discuss international timesharing, custody, and what to do if your ex takes your kids to another country without consent, and just ways to at least seek help in these types of situations. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And listeners, if you or someone you know is going through a divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at floridawomensLawGroup.com. You'll find our practice areas and the link to our website in the show notes. Thank you for listening.